Zach Better from Phoenix, Arizona. I do extreme endurance, or most specifically kind of ultra distance running. And ultra distance running is kind of a diverse sport. You can get everything from about 50 kilometers up to, some races they'll do like multi-day. There's one race that goes 3,100 miles. So there's quite a bit of variety between terrain and distance within the sport. For me specifically, I kind of focus mostly on like 50 kilometers to about 100 miles or so is what I've done mostly the last few years. I think a lot of people get into it because they have this like intrigue with, well, I wonder if I can go that far, and it just kind of builds on itself. They've done a marathon or something like that, and then they want to try a 50K, and then after they finish the 50K, they try to see about a 50 mile, and it just kind of keeps building and building. For me, I raced in high school and college, track and cross country, and in college I really started to kind of get to know and enjoy the whole process of like peak training and stuff like that. And one thing I kind of learned pretty quick was my most favorite workout of the week was the long run. So after college, I just started kind of doing long runs all the time, and it didn't take too long before I signed up for a 50 miler. And after I did that 50 miler, I was kind of hooked, and then it was just looking for different races in different areas and different distances and stuff like that. So it's usually kind of sometimes like a friend will mention it, someone will read an article or a story, and they'll wonder if they can try it or do it, and then once they do, they're stuck in the sport. My biggest accomplishment is I hold the American record for 100 miles, and I did that in 2015. It was 11 hours, 40 minutes, and 55 seconds, which comes out to just about a 7-minute mile pace. And then I also have a world record for distance run in 12 hours, which is they have these events called timed events where you just see how far you can kind of get in a specific time frame. And I was able to run 101.7 miles for 12 hours, and that was a world record. So those are probably the two top things. I guess what keeps me going is, I'm pretty curious, so I'm always wondering like, well, if I train this way, how will that improve my performance at this distance, or even going back to the same events and just seeing if I can improve. So I've got probably a healthy curiosity just to kind of see how far I can push myself. And until I guess I break down, I'll probably keep doing that. Yeah, when I first kind of started taking distance running seriously, kind of at the end of high school, beginning of college, I started looking at nutrition because it just seemed like that was a pretty big piece to the puzzle. And this would have been back in like between 2008 and 2010, and it's pretty much anything you looked at back then, and even a lot so now is going to kind of skew you towards a high carb diet. So I did that. I was what I would call like a real clean kind of whole food, high carb diet, whereas I probably 60-70% carbohydrate, and then kind of probably an even split between fats and proteins. And that seemed to be fine for the most part the first few years. And then when I kind of really started to get into ultra running, I did my first ultra race in end of 2010, and then by the end of 2011 I had done 350 milers in about a 9-week time frame. And one thing I noticed during kind of the training for that and then the racing was like some weird things were starting to kind of happen. I was 24 years old at the time, and I noticed I'd be waking up like a bunch of times during the night, like 4 or 5 times of the night, and I'd have these kind of big energy swings throughout the course of the day. Like it might feel good during the workout, but then in the afternoon you kind of feel like you could just take a nap. And just like other weird little things too, like a lot of swelling in like my ankles and things like that after big training efforts. And my thought was like, these aren't necessarily like ideal health markers for someone in their mid-20s. I should probably feel a lot better than that. So I kind of started questioning whether the lifestyle was sustainable, and you could just make a strong argument that the activity was a huge driver there. But I loved it still. I wasn't like sick of running and didn't want to stop training hard and going to these races. So I thought I would try kind of addressing it nutritionally first. And around that same time, I actually had started listening to more podcasts. I was more or less actually looking for a way to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or justify the amount of training I was doing. I thought if I can learn something while I'm running, at least I can come back home and say I learned something as well as I got this run in, instead of I just spent 3 hours running around. So I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and I started kind of skewing them towards like health and nutrition type stuff. And that's when I kind of found out about the high fat, low carb diet, or a lot of people see that as like the ketogenic diet. So I kind of started playing around with that, and I was really fortunate. I was able to connect with guys like Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney, and they kind of had a lot of the research at the time behind it, and the concepts. So I tried it out, and the first thing I really noticed is a lot of those kind of goofy things that I was noticing pop up during my training and recovery started to go away. Like I started sleeping straight through the night, started having even energy levels throughout the course of the day. So at that point I was pretty well sold that it would be, that sort of a diet or that sort of a nutrition program, and it was just a matter of kind of how do I piece this into a full training block lifestyle that I'm trying to do. So I've been doing it now for about 7 years at this point, and I've tweaked things and kind of manipulated things, but it's very much a high fat, low carb approach. I probably average about 10% carbohydrate throughout the course of the year when you average in my higher carb training phases, and then when I say higher carb, I mean high for me, and then my lowest phases of training with carbohydrates. So yeah, it's very much periodized, kind of like you'd see a periodized training, whether that be for endurance or for strength or anything like that, where I kind of divide my year up into phases. And so I'll have like a phase where I'm more or less focusing on recovery. That's usually after like a big race, or at the end of a season, where I might take a few days or a week where I don't run at all, and then I'm gonna build back really slowly. So like I might have like a 6 to 8 week stretch where my training volume and intensity is significantly lower than it is during peak training. So during that phase of the year, I don't see a huge necessity to have carbohydrates in much quantity at all. Sometimes I'll go zero carb during those phases, but usually that's when I would be more along the lines of what you see as like a clinical ketogenic style nutrition plan, where carbs are between like 30 to 50 grams. Once I start kind of getting into training again and the volume starts building up, that's when I'll start kind of adding a little bit more carb back. And then when I get into kind of the real specified phase where volume and intensity are kind of at their highest in my training, and sometimes those phases are 20 hours a week of training. It's usually a combination of running, a little bit of strength work and mobility work in the gym as well. That's when my carbs are going to be the highest. And sometimes when I'm at my highest training days and stuff, I'll let my carbs get up into like 20% or so range. So what I've noticed that what that kind of does is it puts me in a position on race day where I'm fat adapted enough where I don't have to rely as heavily on in-race fueling as maybe I would have had to in the past when I was high carb. And if I look at kind of the fueling strategies I've used on a high fat approach versus a high carb approach, I've been able to reduce my in-race fueling by over 50% in most cases. And when you're running as far as 100 miles and you're out there all day, like a big hurdle or a big variable to consider is your ability to kind of digest food or your inability to do that. A lot of people have had races sabotaged by, not being able to digest food in the latter part of a race, and they find themselves puking up their race fuel and stuff like that. So I think being able to kind of get a system of nutrition that is sustainable during the run itself is a huge advantage. And that's part of the reason why I've kind of really gravitated towards the approach as well. Yeah, that's where, a lot of times I think people think like, well, you must be eating like bacon and coconut oil during the race, and that's how it would maybe look on paper. But actually the way I look at it is a little bit different. Even when you're fat adapted or keto, you're kind of still working with these two kind of like fuel tanks. You have like your body fat, and a lot of times people think, well, a really lean athlete doesn't have much body fat or has no body fat. But that's not the case. Like even the leanest endurance athletes out there have enough onboard body fat to make that their biggest fuel tank. The smallest one is your muscle glycogen. That's the one you can deplete during an event. So when I'm racing, I'm trying to digest as little as possible. I'm kind of looking at it from an angle of I've got this kind of blood volume limit that my body's holding, and that blood volume is going to be asked to do a variety of things, and digestion is one of them. Which is going to potentially deter from other things like muscle functioning and cooling of skin and things like that. So I try to keep the stuff I digest like really easy to digest. And since I'm going to be able to rely on body fat stores as my onboard fat fuel during a race, the only thing left to really consider would be the carbohydrate or the glycogen. So I will do like you know, like some sports drinks and things like that, or you know, there's like a variety of other like little like gels and things that people will use during these races. I've done a lot of different stuff too, like banana chips and, you know, even potato chips and things like that. But really my goal there is I'm gonna have like a very like low level of carbohydrates kind of sprinkled in throughout the course of the event, just to kind of keep that fuel tank from emptying out. When I'm doing a little less running is when I maybe focus on lifting a little bit, you know, relative to me, heavier weights. But I do like to kind of keep that in the rotation. You know, I think some of those like core movement weights like deadlifts and squats and things like that are valuable even for endurance athletes. So I'll do quite a bit of, well, not quite a bit, but I'll include some of that in my training, and a lot of core work and mobility work as well, just to kind of keep things from breaking down. I think it's smart to always kind of try to unpack it as opposed to look at the thing as a whole. So if even a 10-minute walk is daunting, I think the move is to not sit there and start and think, okay, I got to get to 10 minutes, got to get 10 minutes. You got to give yourself little benchmarks along the way. So I'm going to get these first 2 minutes over with, and then I'm going to focus on the next once I get there. And that way you can kind of compartmentalize in your mind, so you're not trying to wrap your head around something that was previously unachievable or you previously thought you couldn't do or didn't want to do. And that's the type of approach I usually use with these longer events, because you know, if I start a 100-mile race or do a 12-hour timed event and go in there and start, and I'm automatically thinking about hour 12, and during the first hour, I'm gonna psych myself out. So a lot of times it's like, well, I'm gonna get to, you know, mile 5, or I'm gonna get to this aid station or something like that, and then I just hyper focus on that and just try not to worry about the rest of it until it comes. Zach Bitter, I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, and you know, folks can find me on my website at zachbitter.com or on social media at Zach Bitter on Instagram and at zbitter on Twitter.